The gun was already pressed against Wesley Quinn's temple when Ada Atwood burst through the saloon doors and screamed his name. She had ridden 12 miles in the dark to get here. Her horse was lathered, her dress was torn at the hem, and her hair had come loose from its pins somewhere around the 3rd-mile marker outside of Dusty Creek. None of that mattered. What mattered was the man she loved standing with his hands raised, a pistol at his skull, and the cold, dead eyes of Harlan Voss studying her from across the room like she was a problem he hadn't accounted for. "Well," Harlan said slowly, his lips pulling into something that was not a smile. "Looks like she knows." Wesley's jaw tightened. He didn't move his eyes toward her. He kept them straight ahead, steady, the way a man keeps himself calm when the wrong kind of movement means a bullet. But Ada saw the muscle feather in his cheek, the small betrayal of emotion he was fighting to contain. "Ada," he said quietly, "you need to leave." "I am not leaving." "You need to, Wesley Quinn. If you tell me to leave one more time, I will personally—" "She's brave," Harlan interrupted, almost appreciatively. He tilted his head, and the man holding the gun, a thick-necked enforcer named Deke who smelled of tobacco and cruelty, pressed the barrel harder. "Rode all the way out here in the middle of the night. Must have seen my men at the crossroads. Must have figured something out." He paused. "What exactly did you figure out, Miss Atwood?" Ada's chest was heaving. The saloon around her was silent. 3 of Harlan's men sat at tables, hands on their guns, not drawing yet but ready. The barkeep had vanished entirely behind the counter. A single lantern hung overhead, throwing orange shadow across everything. "I know about the deed," she said. The room changed. Not physically, not with any noise or movement. But the air shifted, and she felt it, the way a storm changes the pressure in the valley before the first drop falls. Harlan Voss stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wesley. "You told her." "I didn't tell her anything," Wesley said. "Then she's smarter than you gave her credit for." Harlan moved toward Ada slowly, unhurried, the way a man moves when he believes he holds every card. "The deed to the Quinn Ranch. Signed over to my father 12 years ago under circumstances that Mr. Quinn here disputes. Circumstances that, if examined too closely by a judge, might raise some uncomfortable questions about how exactly my family came to own half of Dusty Creek County." Ada did not step back. She stood her ground on the worn floorboards, her boots planted, her eyes level with his. "That deed was forged." Silence. Then Harlan Voss laughed, short and cold. "Lock her up with him." That was the night Ada Atwood stopped being afraid, and it was nowhere near the beginning of the story. 3 months earlier, the town of Dusty Creek, Texas, sat baking under an August sun that had no mercy in it. The year was 1881, and the cattle trails that once ran through the territory were slowly giving way to rail lines pushing steadily westward, dragging the future along with them whether the old ranching families wanted it or not. Dusty Creek had a post office, a church, a general store, a doctor who drank too much, a schoolhouse with a leaking roof, and a saloon that did more business than all of them combined. It also had, as of the 15th of August, a new schoolteacher. Ada Atwood arrived on the afternoon stage from San Antonio, 24 years old, with a trunk of books, a small embroidered bag, a letter of appointment from the county school board, and absolutely no illusions about what she was getting into. She had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a printer whose hands were always stained with ink and whose heart was always stained with books. Her mother had died when Ada was 11, and the years after that had been shaped by her father's quiet, bookish love and the particular kind of independence that grows in a girl who is raised to think for herself. She had trained as a teacher in the city, but the city positions were taken by women with better connections and longer family roots in Texas society. Dusty Creek had advertised in the San Antonio paper. Ada had answered. The stage stopped in front of the general store, and Ada climbed down into the dust with her trunk and looked at the town with clear brown eyes. It was not impressive. The main street was unpaved and rutted. 2 dogs were sleeping in front of the saloon. A man was asleep in a rocking chair outside the barber shop, his hat over his face. A woman in a yellow dress was sweeping her porch with the dedication of someone who had long ago accepted the futility of fighting dust. What Ada noticed beyond all of it was the land, the flat immensity of it, the sky that was so large it seemed like an architectural choice, a deliberate grandeur as though the country itself was making a point. She had grown up with city rooftops cutting the sky into manageable pieces. This was different. This made the chest feel both tight and expanded at the same time. "You must be the new teacher," she turned. The man standing behind her was somewhere around 30, she guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had clearly been outdoors for most of its existence. He was lean in the way that working men are lean, all purpose and no waste. He wore a plain shirt, worn work trousers, boots that had been resoled at least twice, and a weathered hat he wasn't wearing at the moment, holding it instead in both hands with a politeness that surprised her. "Wesley Quinn," he said, and offered a hand. Ada Atwood, she shook it. His grip was firm but not aggressive about it. "Are you the welcoming committee?" "Not exactly. I was picking up feed at the store. I saw the stage come in." He paused. "The schoolhouse is 2 blocks north. I can carry your trunk if you'd like. I can manage it." He looked at the trunk, which was genuinely enormous and clearly extremely heavy, and then looked back at her with a perfectly even expression. "All right." She lasted about 40 feet before she had to admit she could not, in fact, manage it alone. He was still walking beside her, saying nothing, and when she stopped and looked at him, there was no satisfaction in his face. He simply picked up the other end of the trunk and helped her carry it the rest of the way without saying a word about it. She decided she liked him, provisionally. The schoolhouse was indeed leaking. Ada could see where rain had come through the roof and stained the ceiling boards dark, and 2 of the windows had broken panes covered with oilskin. The desks were old but solid. There were perhaps 20 of them. A chalkboard ran the length of the front wall. It had been a long time since anyone had cared for this room, but the bones of it were good. "It needs work," Wesley said. "Everything worth having needs work," Ada said, setting down her end of the trunk and looking around with her hands on her hips. He looked at her for a moment as if that was not the response he had expected. "The town's not rich," he said. "The school board doesn't have much money. The last teacher left after 6 months. "Why?" A pause. "Harlan Voss." She turned. "Who is Harlan Voss?" Something moved across Wesley's face. It was brief, carefully contained, but she caught it, that particular compression of features that means a man is deciding how much to say. "He owns the biggest operation in the county," he said finally. "The Voss Ranch. His father built it up 30 years ago. Harlan runs it now." Another pause. "He runs most things one way or another. And the last teacher. She wanted to teach the Mexican children in town alongside the others. Harlan didn't like it, made things difficult." Ada turned to look out the window at the street below. She could see 2 children chasing a chicken across the dust, one of them Mexican, one clearly a rancher's son by the look of his clothes, both of them laughing identically. "I see," she said. "It might be worth knowing before you make any decisions," Wesley said carefully. "I've already made my decisions," Ada said. "I'll teach every child in this town who wants to learn. That's what I was hired to do." Another silence. Then she heard what might, if she had been listening very hard, have been a quiet exhale that sounded almost like relief. "I'll fix the roof," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that. The Quinns have always fixed the school roof. My father did it, his father before him." He settled his hat back on his head. "It needs doing." He left before she could say anything else. Ada stood in the dusty, sun-warmed schoolhouse and felt something she had not felt since her father died 2 years ago, which was the particular warm weight of a person making a simple, genuine offer of help. It was not a feeling she was accustomed to distrusting, but she had learned in the years of being alone and managing alone to notice it carefully. She noticed it. The first week of school brought 19 children of varying ages to Ada's classroom, including 4 children from the Mexican families who worked the smaller farms and did seasonal labor in the county. two children of the local blacksmith, a shy girl of 8 who turned out to be the brightest student in the room, and one deeply reluctant 12-year-old boy named Caleb Quinn, who arrived on the second day with sawdust in his hair and a defensive expression that dared anyone to make something of it. Wesley's younger brother, as it turned out. Their parents had died of fever 4 years ago, and Wesley had been raising Caleb on the Quinn ranch ever since, running what remained of the family cattle operation while simultaneously being something close to a father to a boy who missed his own. Ada learned all of this not from Wesley, but from the town. Small towns had their own information systems, detailed and largely accurate, and within the first week she knew that Wesley Quinn was 29 years old, had been briefly engaged to a woman from Abilene who had left when she saw the state of the ranch's finances, that he worked harder than almost anyone in the county, that he was liked but not always understood, that he was private in a way that some people mistook for coldness, but that those who knew him better recognized as a different kind of thing entirely. She also learned about the dispute over the ranch. It came out in pieces. The Quinn Ranch had originally been a substantial piece of land, nearly 400 acres, settled by Wesley's grandfather in the 1840s. Over the years, through what the official county records described as a series of legitimate transactions, roughly half of that acreage had been acquired by the Voss family. Wesley's father, in the last years of his life, had become convinced that at least one of those transactions involved a forged deed. That land had been taken from the Quinns under false documentation, and he had begun to gather evidence. Then he died, and the evidence had disappeared with him. Wesley had not abandoned the question. But he was careful about how he pursued it, because Harlan Voss was exactly the kind of man who made people's lives very difficult when crossed, and Caleb was 12 years old and needed stability, not a war. Ada sat with all of this quietly during her first weeks in Dusty Creek, teaching her children, eating her supper at the boarding house where she rented a room from Mrs. Crane, a widow of formidable disposition and unexpectedly kind cooking, and letting the town reveal itself to her the way places do when you pay attention. Wesley came to fix the school roof on a Saturday, 3 weeks after she arrived. He brought 2 men from neighboring ranches with him, which was evidently just how things worked out here, one person's need becoming a communal project without much fuss about it. Ada brought out a jug of water and a pan of cornbread she had made that morning, which seemed to be the correct response because all 3 men were visibly grateful. She worked in the classroom while they worked on the roof, sorting through the donated books she had accumulated and creating lesson plans for the coming weeks. The sound of hammering overhead was rhythmic and oddly companionable. At one point there was a loud bang followed by a colorful word from one of the other men, then Wesley's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out, then laughter. When they came down in the early afternoon, Wesley knocked on the schoolhouse door before entering, which made the other men look at him with a kind of knowing amusement he appeared to ignore. "Roof's solid," he said. "Should hold through winter." "Thank you," Ada said. "Genuinely, how much do I owe you?" "Nothing." It's not a transaction," he said. "It's just what needs doing." She looked at him for a moment. In the slanted afternoon light coming through the newly repaired window, she could see his face more clearly than she had before. There was something careful about the way he held himself, a quality of restraint that was not unfriendly but was very deliberate, as though he had learned at some point that the world was more manageable when you didn't let it see too much of you. "The cornbread was very good," he said, which was clearly as close as he was going to get to expressing gratitude. "There's more," she said. He sat down at one of the student desks, which was slightly too small for him, and which he managed to make look perfectly natural anyway, and ate 2 more pieces of cornbread while she told him about her plan to expand the curriculum to include basic mathematics for the older students and a small lending library for families in town. He listened without interrupting, which was its own form of rare courtesy. "The Mexican families," he said when she had finished. "Vargas and Reyes. Their children won't have had any schooling before. I know. I spoke with Mrs. Vargas yesterday. Her daughter Elena is 7, very bright. She's been learning to read on her own from a Bible, did you know that? A child taught herself to read from a Bible. Something shifted in his expression very slightly. No, I didn't know that. She's going to be remarkable, Ada said. All these children are if you give them the right conditions. Wesley was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of desks. My father used to say the Quinn name would outlast the ranch land, that what a man builds in people is harder to steal than what he builds in soil. It was the most personal thing he had said. Ada could tell he knew it from the slight shift in his posture, the way he looked back at the cornbread instead of at her. But he didn't take it back, and she valued that. He sounds like he was a good man, she said. He was. Harlan Voss made the last years of his life very unhappy. The name landed with weight. Ada looked at Wesley carefully. You're still pursuing it, the deed. His eyes came back to her. What makes you say that? Because you mentioned it, because men who have given up don't bring things up. They go quiet about them entirely. He studied her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. You're very perceptive. I was raised by a printer. Printers read everything. I was raised to notice what's between the lines. A long silence. Then quietly, there's a land records office in Austin. I've been corresponding with a clerk there. There are irregularities in the transfer documentation from 1869, signatures that don't match known samples of my father's handwriting from the same period. It's not proof, but it points towards something. Is there anyone else who knows? My father's old ranch hand, Pete Holloway, is still alive. He was there when the transfer was supposedly signed. He's told me the story was wrong, but he's old and he's scared, and Harlan Voss knows where he lives. Ada absorbed this. Is Harlan Voss capable of actual violence, beyond making things difficult? Wesley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His family didn't build what they built in this county by being gentle about it. Outside, one of the men called Wesley's name, indicating they were heading back. Wesley stood, picked up his hat, and paused at the door. He turned back as though he was going to say something, and then appeared to change his mind. Thank you for the cornbread, Miss Atwood, he said, and left. Ada sat alone in the quiet schoolroom for a long time after that, thinking about forged deeds and old ranch hands and a man who carried a heavy, inherited grief with such careful discipline that most people probably couldn't see it at all. She could see it. That was the problem, or possibly the beginning of the solution. She hadn't quite decided which yet. September settled over Dusty Creek with marginally cooler nights and the distant sound of cattle drives moving along the southern trail. Ada's classroom filled with the ordinary miracles of children learning things. The moment a word became a sentence. The moment numbers became a pattern. The moment a child looked up from a book with that particular light in their eyes that meant the story had gotten hold of them. Elena Vargas turned out to be, as Ada had suspected, spectacularly gifted, with a memory like a steel trap and a habit of asking questions that stopped Ada in her tracks. Caleb Quinn was prickly and defensive and deeply intelligent underneath both. He had the same quality his brother had, that careful containment, but in a 12-year-old it looked different, more brittle, more obviously a protective construction over something raw. Ada treated him exactly like every other student, which was to say with complete respect for his capacity and no patience for his performances of indifference. He resented this for about 2 weeks. Then he started finishing his assignments. Wesley came to the schoolhouse on Fridays. It was never for any dramatic reason. There was always a practical justification, a window latch that needed tightening, a question from Caleb about some assignment, a donation of wood for the stove that would be needed once the cold came. Ada began to expect him. She began, if she was honest with herself, to look forward to it. They would talk for an hour or so, sometimes 2, in the late afternoon when the school day was done. These conversations ranged widely from the immediate concerns of Dusty Creek, the state of the water supply, the coming cattle season, the question of whether the rail line would eventually come through and what that would do to the town, to larger things, books. The war that had ended 16 years ago, and whose wounds were still very present in this part of Texas. The nature of justice, and what it looked like when official channels failed. Ada noticed that Wesley never talked about himself in terms of what he wanted. He talked about what needed doing, about Caleb, about the ranch, about the town. It was only in the spaces between that she could catch glimpses of the person underneath all that purposefulness. A dry humor that appeared without warning and was gone before you fully registered it. A genuine tenderness he tried to hide, most evident in how he talked about his brother, and occasionally in how he talked about the land itself, the particular piece of Texas his grandfather had settled, and that he had grown up on, and that he was fighting quietly and determinedly to protect. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the schoolhouse steps in the cooling air, Ada with a cup of tea from the small stove she'd set up inside, Wesley with a cup of coffee he'd brought himself in a battered tin canteen, and she said, without entirely planning to, "Do you ever get tired of carrying all of it?" He looked at her. "Carrying what?" "Everything, the ranch, Caleb, your father's unfinished business, the worry about Voss, all of it." A silence. He looked out at the street, where the evening activity of Dusty Creek was playing out in its small domestic rhythms. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes, just that, just the honest word." But it cost him something, she could tell, and she didn't push any further. After a moment he said, quietly, "I don't let myself think about it too much. There isn't a lot of point in cataloging things you can't set down. You could set some of it down. The ranch needs—" "I don't mean the ranch," Ada said. "I mean the grief. You're allowed to grieve your parents. You're allowed to acknowledge that what was done to your family was wrong and that carrying it alone for years is an enormous weight." He was very still. The evening light had gone golden and low, and in it he looked younger than 30, or maybe just more unguarded than he usually allowed himself to be. "My father used to say grief was a luxury for people who weren't needed," he said finally. "Your father was wrong about that," Ada said, gently but clearly. "Grief is not a luxury, it's a necessity, the price of love. You're only in trouble when you refuse to pay it." Wesley looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was shifting, the careful architecture of his containment slightly, almost invisibly, rearranging itself. "Where did you study?" he asked. "Philosophy." "My father's print shop," Ada said. "Same place I studied everything." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one, and it transformed his face in a way that made Ada's chest do something she decided to examine later when she was alone. In October, Harlan Voss came to the school. He came on a Tuesday during lessons, which was a deliberate choice because everything Harlan Voss did was deliberate. He was 41 years old, a broad man with a carefully trimmed beard and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He rode up on a fine horse, which he left tied to the hitching post, and knocked on the school door with the authority of someone who owns the door. Ada opened it. "Miss Atwood," he said, removing his hat with a courtesy that was technically correct and somehow still deeply offensive. "I've heard good things about your work here." "Mr. Voss," Ada said, because she knew who he was immediately. There was no other candidate. "What can I do for you?" "I have a son," Harlan said. "Robert, he's 10. I'd like him enrolled." "The school is open to every child in the county," Ada said. "He's welcome." Harlan smiled. It was an assessing smile, the kind that was deciding how much you knew and how much of a problem you might be. "Good. I want him sitting at the front." "Seating is arranged by age group," Ada said pleasantly. "Robert will sit with the other children his age, wherever that arrangement puts him." A pause. "I see. I do try to run the classroom consistently," Ada said, "for all students, including the Mexican children I've noticed you've been teaching." "Including every child in Dusty Creek who wishes to attend," Ada said. Another pause, longer this time. "I hear you've been spending time with Wesley Quinn," he said, as if this were a natural continuation of the conversation. Ada kept her expression perfectly neutral. "This is a small town, Mr. Voss. People spend time with many people." "The Quinn family," Harlan said carefully, has a tendency toward claims and grievances that don't serve the stability of this community. I find that people who become close to Wesley Quinn sometimes develop an unfortunate interest in those claims. I find, Ada said, equally carefully, that children learn best in a stable and consistent environment, which is what I'm trying to create here. Was there anything else? Harlan looked at her for a moment with those cold, assessing eyes. Then he smiled again, put his hat back on, and stepped back. Robert will start next Monday, he said. Good day, Miss Atwood. Ada stood in the doorway and watched him ride away with a feeling she could only describe as the alertness of a person who has just had a very clear warning and intends to take it seriously. That evening she told Wesley. He was quiet for a while. They were at the schoolhouse, the last light going purple outside the windows, the stove putting out its small, reliable warmth. He's watching, Wesley said finally. He's watching you through me, Ada said. He came here to see what I knew and to warn me off without quite saying it. Did it work? Ada looked at him steadily. What do you think? Wesley looked back at her, and for a moment the careful distance he maintained was simply gone, and she could see him clearly, the exhausted determination, the quiet anger that had been burning low for 4 years, and underneath both of those things something else, something warmer and more uncertain and less armored than everything else he showed the world. I think you should be careful, he said. I think you should stay away from this. I think, Ada said, that you should tell me everything you know about that deed. Ada, it was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to notice it too. The silence between them was different afterward, fuller, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Tell me, she said quietly. He told her. Over the next 3 evenings he laid it all out. The original Quinn land grant from his grandfather. The series of transactions his father had tracked. 3 separate deed transfers between 1865 and 1872. During the chaotic Reconstruction period when land records in Texas were notoriously unreliable and fraud was epidemic. The specific 1869 transfer that his father had found first, in which 47 acres of Quinn land on the west side had supposedly been sold to the Voss family for a recorded sum that was roughly 1/3 of its actual value. The signature on the deed that didn't match other documents from the same period. The testimony of Pete Holloway, the ranch hand who had been present that day and who insisted that Wesley's father had never signed anything, that he had been shown a document after the fact and told it was already done. And then the document his father had been gathering toward, the letter. A letter from a county recorder in 1870 acknowledging that he had processed a deed transfer for the Voss family under circumstances he was not comfortable with. The letter had been in his father's keeping. After his father died, the letter had vanished from the ranch house. Either it had been taken or it had been lost in the confusion of grief, but either way it was gone, and without it the other evidence was strong but not conclusive. Where would that kind of letter end up? Ada asked. If it was taken, with Voss, Wesley said, locked away somewhere, or destroyed. If it were destroyed, there'd be no reason to take it. You take it because having it means you can control whether it ever surfaces. Ada turned this over. Who else knew about the letter before your father died? Wesley thought. Pete Holloway, my father's lawyer, a man named Garrett who died in 1878. The county recorder himself, a man named Cross who resigned and moved to New Mexico. He paused. And the circuit judge who heard my father's initial complaint in 1877, a Judge Elias Brand. Is Brand still on the circuit? Yes. What happened to your father's complaint? It was dismissed for insufficient evidence. Brand ruled the deed valid. Ada looked at him. Was Brand paid off? Wesley held her gaze. I believe so. I can't prove it. The clerk in Austin you mentioned. His name is Thomas Reed. He's been quietly cooperative. He found the signature irregularities on his own. He contacted me. Ada sat quietly for a moment, something organizing itself in her thinking. There's a pattern here. Voss acquired land through fraud. He used his money to ensure that official channels stayed closed. Anyone who gets close to the evidence either gets scared off, bought off, or she stopped. Or dead, Wesley said quietly. My father's death was from fever. It was real. But he was already sick when he was pursuing the records, and there were people who made his last year very difficult and stressful, which didn't help. Ada looked at him. In the quiet warmth of the schoolroom, with the night outside pressing against the windows and the town going slowly to sleep around them, she felt the full weight of what he had been carrying for 4 years. Not just the injustice, not just the grief, but the aloneness of it, having to carry a true thing in a world that had arranged itself to call it a lie. Without entirely planning to, she reached across the desk between them and put her hand over his. Wesley went very still. He looked down at her hand on his and then up at her face with an expression she couldn't quite decode. It was not unwelcoming. It was more like a man who has been very cold for a very long time and is not quite sure yet whether it is safe to stop bracing. You're not alone with it anymore, Ada said. A long pause. Ada, his voice was careful. What I'm trying to do with Voss is dangerous. If he figures out that I've got someone helping me gather evidence, he'll— I know, she said. You have a school, children who need you, a life you've built here. I know that too. Then why would you? Because it's the right thing, she said. And because you matter. She said the last part quietly but without flinching. The words seemed to land somewhere deep in Wesley Quinn that had not heard anything like it in a very long time. He turned his hand under hers slowly and held it. They sat there in the quiet schoolroom with the stove ticking and the October night outside, holding hands across a student's desk, neither of them saying anything else for a while. That was October. By November, they were working together. Ada began with the library. Her father's print shop connections meant she had contacts in Austin and San Antonio who could track down documents. She wrote careful, oblique letters to Thomas Reed, the Austin clerk, asking specific questions about the transfer documentation that Wesley had identified. Reed, who had his own reasons for wanting the truth to come out, his predecessor in the records office, had been dismissed under suspicious circumstances that Reed believed were connected to the Voss family's activities, was more forthcoming than Wesley had expected. Reed confirmed that the 1869 deed transfer had been processed by a recorder named Alston Cross, who had since moved to Silver City, New Mexico. Reed also confirmed that there was a second document in the Austin records that had been misfiled, a survey map from 1868 showing the Quinn land boundaries, which did not match the boundaries described in the 1869 transfer deed. The discrepancy was small but significant. It was the kind of error you made when you were forging a deed without the original survey available to copy correctly. Wesley rode out to see Pete Holloway. Pete was 70 years old and lived in a small house at the edge of town, kept a garden, and seemed to be trying very hard to be invisible. When Wesley arrived, the old man looked at him from the doorway with an expression that was equal parts guilt and fear. I can't help you, Wesley, he said before Wesley had even spoken. I know you're scared, Pete. Harlan Voss has 3 men who work for him who are not ranch hands, Pete said. You understand what I mean. 3 men who are not ranch hands. I understand. Your father was a good man and what happened to him was wrong. But I am old and I am tired and I do not want to end my days in a box before my time. Wesley stood quietly. I'm not asking you to testify yet. I'm asking if you'll write down what you remember and give it to me, in your own handwriting with a date, not for a court, just so it exists. Pete studied him for a long time, and if it gets back to Voss, it won't come from me. Another long silence. The wind moved through Pete's garden, rustling the dry late-season stalks. The old man looked out at them with the expression of someone calculating something very personal. Give me a week, he said finally. Wesley gave him a week. He also spent that week quietly going through every paper his father had left, looking for anything he might have missed in the grief-blurred weeks after the death 4 years ago. He found nothing new. But he organized what he had, made copies in his own hand, and gave one set of copies to Ada. Why are you giving these to me? She asked. Because Voss's men have been to my ranch twice in the past month. Once to ask about fencing on the north boundary, Once to quote-unquote check on whether I was having any trouble with the cattle. They're watching me. If anything happens to my copies, yours exist. Ada looked at the papers in her hand. Where should I keep them? Somewhere he wouldn't think to look, she thought for a moment. The schoolhouse. Inside the back cover of the Latin grammar, third shelf. Harlan Voss is not a man who opens Latin grammars. Wesley looked at her with something that was moving steadily beyond admiration into territory he was having more and more difficulty ignoring. "You're very good at this," he said. "My father printed a newspaper," Ada said. "He taught me that the most important thing about information is that it has to survive. You keep copies, you distribute them, you make sure no single person is the only custodian of a true thing." Wesley was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, as if he were making a decision he was not entirely sure was wise, he said, "Ada, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When this is over, whatever the outcome," he stopped, started again. "I've been trying to think about what I'm doing here very carefully. Because I don't want to—" Another pause. He was not a man who fumbled for words often, which made the fumbling more significant. "I don't want you to think that I value your help so much that I'm being reckless with your heart." Ada was very still. The afternoon light was falling through the schoolhouse windows the way it did at this hour, golden and exact, illuminating the dust motes in the air and the rows of small desks and Wesley Quinn's careful, earnest, slightly terrified face. "Wesley," she said gently, "are you trying to tell me that you have feelings for me?" "Yes," he said, with the relief of a man who has been given the word he couldn't find. "And you're worried that those feelings might be mixed up with gratitude or proximity or the intensity of what we're doing together." It seemed worth being careful about. "That's very thoughtful," Ada said, "and probably unnecessary." She paused. "I have known since about the third Friday you came to fix something that didn't need fixing that I was in considerable trouble where you were concerned." He looked at her. The window latch was fine, Wesley. It has been fine the whole time." Something broke open in his face slowly, like dawn happening. "I know," he said very quietly. She laughed. And then he did too. A real laugh, not the small controlled almost smile she had been cataloging since September, but a full, genuine, startled laugh that changed the whole quality of the air in the room. He reached out and took her hand and held it, and she held his back, and they stood there in the afternoon light of the schoolhouse with the Latin grammar on the third shelf hiding their secrets and the whole complicated, dangerous, uncertain future ahead of them. "When it's over," he said. "When it's over," she agreed. But there were things they couldn't have known yet. November went hard and fast. Pete Holloway produced his written account, 4 careful pages in a shaky but legible hand, describing what he had witnessed in the summer of 1869. Wesley's father going to the county land office, being shown a deed he claimed he had not signed, being told the transfer was already recorded, being informed by Alston Cross that the process had been handled by the Voss family's lawyer and that there was nothing to be done. 4 pages of detail. Pete's age, the weather that week, the exact words used, the other person in the room that day, a man Pete had never seen before or since, who was identified to him only as the lawyer's clerk. The clerk, as Thomas Reed eventually confirmed through his research in Austin, had a name. It was a man called James Pell, who had worked for the Voss family's legal operation in the late 1860s and who was, in 1881, working as a bank clerk in Dallas. Wesley wrote to Pell. He expected silence or a denial. Instead, 3 weeks later, he received a letter that he brought to Ada with hands that were not entirely steady. James Pell was dying. Consumption. He had perhaps 6 months. He was a man who had spent 12 years living with what he had done, and he was not inclined to go to his maker without putting it on record. He was willing to provide a sworn affidavit describing his role in the preparation of the forged deed. He wanted only 2 things: that his name be delivered to the appropriate legal authority without being passed through any channel connected to Voss, and that someone competent to understand the legal implications would act on the information before he died. Ada read the letter twice. Then she looked at Wesley. "Who is the appropriate legal authority?" "Not Brand," Wesley said. "Brand is compromised." "The federal court in Austin. Possibly, but we'd need someone to take it there, someone with standing." Ada thought carefully. "Thomas Reed is a state employee. He's found irregularities in official documents. That gives the state controller's office a legitimate interest independent of private complaint." Wesley looked at her. "You know a great deal about how these things work." "My father also printed the state legal notices for 2 years. I learned a lot about bureaucracy." She paused. "There's also the matter of bringing this to someone trustworthy before Voss finds out how far we've gotten." "You think he knows?" "I think," Ada said carefully, "that a man who has kept this buried for 12 years has people watching for exactly this kind of movement. The letter from Pell was sent to your ranch." Wesley went quiet. "His men." "His men check things," Ada said, "and Pell wrote from Dallas with his name on the envelope." Wesley stood up abruptly and went to the window. Ada watched him think, the particular focused stillness that came over him when he was working through something serious. "I need to move fast," he said. "We need to move fast," Ada corrected. He turned and looked at her, and the tenderness in his expression was so clear and so unguarded that it made her breath catch. "We," he said, as if the word was something he was getting used to having. "We," she said firmly. "Now sit down and let's plan." They spent the next 2 evenings constructing a strategy. Ada would write to Thomas Reed directly, not through Wesley, explaining the Pell letter and asking Reed to contact the state controller's land fraud division through official channels. Wesley would travel to Dallas to meet with Pell personally and secure the affidavit before Pell's health deteriorated further. Pete Holloway's written account would be held in reserve, the Latin grammar keeping its secrets safe. Wesley left on a Tuesday. He told Caleb he was going for cattle business, which was true enough. He told Ada he would be back within 10 days. He was back in 7. He had the affidavit. Signed, witnessed by a Dallas notary public, sealed and written in James Pell's careful, consumptive weakened but entirely legible hand. 7 pages. The full account. The instruction from Harlan Voss's father, relayed through the lawyer, to prepare a deed that would match the existing records. The signing of the document by a man paid to impersonate the Quinn patriarch. The bribery of Alston crossed to process and record the false transfer. The instruction to file it under a date that predated the Quinn family's awareness of it. Ada read it beside the stove in the schoolhouse with Wesley standing beside her, still dusty from the road. When she finished, she looked up at him. "It's enough," she said. "It's enough," he agreed. She stood up and hugged him, which was not something she had done before. He was still for a moment, as if uncertain what to do with it, and then his arms came around her with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the hardness of his life and the toughness of his exterior. He held her carefully, as if she were something extremely valuable and somewhat fragile, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. "We should celebrate," she said, still against his shoulder. "When it's done," he said, "not until it's done." She pulled back and looked at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she was still cataloging, the one that contained things he hadn't said yet but that were clearly building toward saying. She touched his face once with her palm, and he closed his eyes briefly. "When it's done," she agreed. It was not done yet. There was still one more thing they hadn't accounted for. Harlan Voss found out. It was 3 days after Wesley returned, and the source was almost certainly one of Voss's men who had been watching the ranch and who had seen Wesley leave and return from a direction that didn't match cattle business. Or possibly it was the letter Ada had sent to Thomas Reed, which had been posted from the Dusty Creek post office by someone who didn't check their surroundings carefully enough. Or possibly it was simply the accumulated movement of things, the way a stone rolling down a hill makes its own noise before it arrives. Ada was at the boarding house when Mrs. Crane came to her door and said that a man outside wanted a word. When Ada went down, she found not Voss himself but one of his non-ranch hand employees, a thin, cold-eyed man who gave his name as Fuller. Fuller told her that Mr. Voss was aware that she had been involving herself in private Quinn family matters, and that Mr. Voss wished to remind her that her teaching appointment was issued by the county school board, and that the county school board's funding was substantially contributed to by the Voss family, and that her position was therefore not as secure as she might imagine. Ada listened to all of this. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Good evening." Fuller looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Atwood, I'd advise you not to be cute about this." "I would advise you," Ada said pleasantly, "to tell Mr. Voss that threatening a woman in her boarding house at 8 in the evening is not going to produce the result he is hoping for. Good evening." She went upstairs and sat on her bed for 10 minutes, letting the adrenaline settle. Then she went to the schoolhouse, took the copies of the documents from behind the Latin grammar, and walked to the telegraph office, which was still open. She sent a telegram to Thomas Reed in Austin. She worded it carefully. She told him that she had reason to believe the situation was developing urgency, and she asked whether he had been able to transmit the referral to the controller's office. Reed telegraphed back within the hour. He had. The controller's land fraud division had opened a review file 4 days ago. The documentation Wesley had gathered through Reed was already on record. Ada felt the relief of that like cool water. She also felt with a clarity that was not pleasant that Harlan Voss was going to move quickly now that he understood time was not on his side. She was right. The next evening, Wesley sent a message to her through Caleb. She needed to come to the Quinn ranch. Something had happened. The message was brief, but the look on Caleb's face told her it was serious. She rode out with Caleb in the last light, the flat Texas countryside spreading out in all directions, the sky going from orange to purple overhead. The Quinn ranch was modest but solid, a stone house his grandfather had built, a barn, corrals, a stretch of good grassland on the east side. Wesley was at the barn when they arrived, and he had a look on his face she had not seen before. "Voss's men were at Pete Holloway's house this afternoon," he said. Ada's stomach dropped. "Pete, he's all right. They didn't hurt him, but they searched his house. Looking for the written account." He looked at her. "It wasn't there. I'd had Pete give it to Reverend Mosley at the church for safekeeping 2 weeks ago. But Pete is badly shaken, and Voss now knows that I've been moving pieces around." "The affidavit," Ada said immediately. "I have it. It needs to leave your ranch." "I know. Give it to me," Ada said. "Right now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went inside and came back with an envelope. She tucked it inside her coat against her body. "I'll take it tonight," she said. "I'll send it to Thomas Reed by post with a copy to the state controller's office directly, and I'll keep a copy at the schoolhouse." "Ada," Wesley said. His voice had dropped to something private. "If Voss decides you're a direct obstacle, then Reed already has what he needs and Voss gains nothing from it," Ada said. "The whole point is to make it undoable." "That's not what I'm worried about," Wesley said. He crossed the short distance between them and took her hands. "I'm worried about you." "I know," she said. "I'm worried about you too. I should have kept you out of this." "You didn't drag me in," she said. "I walked in. There's a difference." He looked at her in the growing dark, and she could see very clearly what he was feeling, not because he was displaying it, but because she knew him well enough by now to read the language of his restraint. She stepped toward him, and he pulled her into him, and she felt the tight, careful way he held her, protecting something that had become too important to be casual about. "Get the affidavit to Reed," he said quietly against her hair, "and then stay in town, stay visible, don't ride out alone." "All right," she said. "And Wesley, I know," he said. "I know." She rode back to town in the dark. She posted the package to Austin herself, at the telegraph office, which also handled mail, using the overnight postal route. She wrote a careful cover letter to the controller's office, stating that she was forwarding a sworn affidavit obtained by Wesley Quinn in the matter of a land fraud complaint currently under review, and that she was providing it as a depositing party given the circumstances. She kept one copy under her mattress and put another back in the Latin grammar. That night, unable to sleep, she lay in her boarding house room and looked at the ceiling and was very clear with herself about what she felt. She had been dancing around it for 2 months with the reasonable caution of a person who has been hurt before, who knows that what you want and what exists are not always the same thing. But clarity was coming whether she wanted it or not. She was in love with Wesley Quinn, not the warm provisional affection of early acquaintance, not the complicated tenderness of shared purpose. Those were present too, folded inside something larger. She was in love with his steadiness and his dry humor and the way he had laughed in the schoolhouse, and the way he held her carefully when what she probably needed was to be held firmly, and the way he had told her she mattered without being able to quite say it directly, in the only way he knew how, by showing up again and again with his hat in his hands. She was in love with him, and the timing was, as usual, deeply inconvenient. The next 3 days were tense. Wesley stayed close to the ranch. Caleb went to school. Ada taught her classes with the deliberate normality of someone who is very aware that normal is a performance right now, but that it matters. Elena Vargas read aloud from a history primer, and her pronunciation was so precise that Ada had to turn to the chalkboard for a moment to compose herself. The children were, as they always were, the thing that made the complicated weight of adult life temporarily recede. On the 3rd day, Thomas Reed sent a telegraph. The state controller's office had received the affidavit. A formal investigation had been opened. 2 agents from the Land Fraud Division would travel to Dusty Creek within 2 weeks to examine the original county records and interview relevant parties. Reed also noted that Alston Cross, the former county recorder now in Silver City, had been contacted by the Austin office and had agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His statement corroborated Pell's account precisely. Ada read this telegraph 3 times. Then she folded it, put it in her pocket, and walked directly to the Quinn ranch. Wesley was in the corral when she arrived. He saw her face from 30 yards away and knew immediately. She gave him the telegraph. He read it. And then he sat down on the corral fence, which was not characteristic, just sat down and looked at the flat Texas horizon for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been pressing against a wall for so long that when it finally gives way he needs a moment to understand that the world is open again. "It's moving," he said finally. "It's moving," Ada said. "You did it, Wesley." "We did it," he said. She smiled. "We did it." He looked at her, and it was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the careful restraint gave way entirely. He climbed off the fence and crossed the few steps between them and kissed her, unhurried and deliberate, with a thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about it for considerably longer than he would probably admit. When he pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression that was completely unguarded. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "for approximately 2 months." "I know," Ada said, slightly breathless. "I was beginning to wonder if you were going to keep finding window latches." He laughed again, that real laugh, and pulled her close, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating and thought that this, right here, was one of the finest moments of her life. Standing in the dust of a Texas ranch in November 1881, with the justice her father figure's legacy deserved finally in motion, and a man she loved with his arms around her. Which is, of course, precisely when things went wrong. Because while they were standing there, and while Ada was riding back to town that evening, and while Dusty Creek was settling into its ordinary evening rhythms, Harlan Voss received word from his contact in Austin that the controller's office had opened a formal investigation. And Harlan Voss, who had spent 20 years protecting something built on a crime, made the decision that desperate men make when they feel the trap closing. He sent Deke and 2 other men to bring Wesley Quinn in. In meant the saloon, which Voss effectively owned, because the saloon was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a place where Voss's authority could be exercised without an immediate audience. The plan, such as it was leverage. Wesley Quinn in a room with a gun to his head was leverage. Leverage meant Ada Atwood would give up whatever she had, tell him where the copies were, and the whole thing would be discredited or delayed long enough for Voss's lawyers to bury it again. It was a bad plan, But frightened men with power make bad plans, which brings us back to the beginning. To Ada Atwood bursting through the saloon doors, 12 miles in the dark, her horse lathered and her hair loose and her heart hammering. To the gun at Wesley's temple and Harlan Voss's cold eyes and the room that changed when she said the word deed. "Lock her up with him," Harlan said. Two of Voss's men took Ada's arms and moved her toward Wesley, which was ironically the one thing in the whole situation that made her feel slightly better. Deke lowered the gun from Wesley's temple but kept it in his hand. Harlan stood in the center of the saloon and looked at both of them with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "Here's the situation," Harlan said. "The investigation out of Austin is new. It has not yet produced results. If the affidavit is discredited, which it can be, since Pell is a dying man with reasons to lie and Cross made his deal under duress, the whole structure of the complaint falls apart." "You're forgetting Pete Holloway," Ada said. "Pete Holloway is an old man who can be persuaded to recant," Harlan said. "And you're forgetting," Ada continued, "that there are 3 separate copies of the affidavit already in the hands of state authorities, plus a sworn account from Alston Cross who has already given his testimony, and that a former employee of your own family has documented the forgery in terms specific enough that a state judge could act on them independent of any complaint from the Quinn family." Harlan looked at her. "Cross gave his testimony yesterday," Ada said. She was improvising slightly, but only slightly. She didn't know the exact timing. But she knew Reed had contacted Cross, and she knew Cross had agreed to cooperate. The testimony was coming if it hadn't already arrived. "You don't need what's in this room anymore. It's already out there." Silence. Long, weighted silence. Wesley was very still beside her. She could feel the tension in him, the readiness and the deliberate choice he was making not to move yet, to let her play it. "She's bluffing," Deke said. "Am I?" Ada said. "Thomas Reed is a state employee who found irregularities in official records. His report to the Comptroller's office is a state action, not a private complaint. You can silence Wesley Quinn. You can silence me. You cannot silence the Texas State Comptroller's office without consequences that would be dramatically worse for you than the original fraud." Harlan Voss looked at her for a very long time. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he said finally. "I'm suggesting that the moment you put a gun to the head of a schoolteacher and a rancher in a saloon, you crossed a line that the land fraud investigation cannot cross. That is now an additional, separate crime, one that exists regardless of what happens to the deed dispute." She paused. "Unless you let us walk out of here right now. In which case, the only thing the state authority has is the land fraud case, which is already filed and already moving, and which you have attorneys and resources to contest legally." It was not a perfect argument, but it was the right argument for the moment, because it gave Harlan Voss an exit that didn't require him to commit a much more serious crime in front of witnesses in a public saloon. Harlan looked at Deke. Deke looked at the gun in his hand. The barkeep, still behind the counter, was staring at the ceiling very intently. "Let them go," Harlan said. His voice was flat and careful. "Tonight, not because I'm afraid of a schoolteacher, because I'm choosing the field where I fight." Deke stepped back. The men holding Ada's arms released her. Wesley moved immediately to her side, and she felt his hand grip her arm, not painfully but firmly, keeping her close. They walked out of the saloon together into the cold November night without looking back. Wesley's horse was at the hitching post outside. Ada's horse, which she had ridden in on, was tied 2 posts down. Wesley untied both animals, handed Ada her reins, and they walked quickly away from the saloon, not running but moving with purpose down the dark street. When they were 2 blocks away, Ada's legs stopped working correctly. She grabbed the hitching post outside the barber shop and held onto it while her body processed what the last 30 minutes had been. Wesley was beside her immediately. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. She breathed. "Just a moment." He stood close, his hand on her back, steady, letting her have the moment. Around them, Dusty Creek was asleep, unaware that anything had happened. The stars were very bright overhead, the vast Texas sky doing its usual architectural statement. "That was the most frightening thing I have ever done," Ada said finally. "You were extraordinary," Wesley said quietly. "You talked us out of that room." "I wasn't sure it was going to work until about halfway through." "I know, I could tell." He paused. "I was trying to figure out whether to take a swing at Deke if it didn't. Please don't ever take a swing at a man with a loaded gun. It was a contingency plan." Ada laughed, which came out slightly hysterical and then settled into genuine laughter. And Wesley laughed too, the two of them standing in the cold, dark street outside the barber shop, laughing at the absurdity and the terror and the relief of it. When the laughter subsided, he pulled her into him and held her tightly, and this time there was nothing careful about it. He held her the way you hold something you have been afraid of losing. "I was scared," he said against her hair, not the word he usually reached for. "When you came through those doors I was so scared." "So was I," she said, "but I wasn't going to leave you in there." "I know," he said. "I know you weren't." They stayed there for a long moment in the cold night, and then Wesley said, "Come to the ranch. I don't want you alone tonight." "I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to. Mrs. Crane's spare room is 9 feet from Harlan Voss's town property," Wesley said. "Come to the ranch. You can have my room. I'll sleep in the barn. Caleb's there. You'll be safe." Ada looked at him. "You'll sleep in the barn." "I'll sleep in the barn," he said with complete sincerity. She went to the ranch. Wesley did sleep in the barn as promised, and when Ada woke the next morning in a quiet stone room that smelled like old wood and cedar, she lay still for a few minutes listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up, the animals, the wind, Caleb's voice somewhere outside asking Wesley something about the horses, and felt a profound and specific peace that was new to her. This was a home. Not hers yet, but a home with good bones and a real history and a man who slept in his own barn to keep her safe. The state investigators arrived from Austin 12 days later. Their names were Agent Clarence Foster and Agent Hugh Greer, and they were thorough, methodical men from the Land Fraud Division who had clearly seen this kind of case before. They reviewed the county records. They examined the survey discrepancy Reed had identified. They took depositions from Wesley, from Pete Holloway, who, bolstered by the fact that state agents were now present, was considerably braver than he had been before, and from Ada, who provided her account of the copies she had made and distributed. James Pell's affidavit was entered into the official record. Alston Cross's statement, taken in Silver City, arrived by post on the 3rd day of the investigation and was entered alongside it. On the 4th day, Agent Foster came to the schoolhouse to speak with Ada. "Miss Atwood," he said, sitting in a student desk in the way men always looked both larger and oddly vulnerable sitting in student desks, "the documentation you gathered and preserved was crucial to this case. I want you to understand that. Without the copies you maintained, this could have been buried again. The documentation was gathered by Wesley Quinn over 4 years, Ada said. I just helped preserve it." "Yes, well," Foster said, with a small, dry smile. "However it arrived, it's sufficient. We'll be recommending a finding of fraudulent transfer to the state attorney general. The Quinn family will be entitled to petition for restoration of the property. Given the evidence, I expect that petition to succeed." Ada sat with that for a moment. 4 years of Wesley carrying this. 12 years since the fraud was committed. Before that, the land his grandfather had settled. 3 generations of a family's work and hope and belonging. "Thank you," she said, because there was no other adequate thing to say. Foster and Greer left Dusty Creek on a Friday. Harlan Voss left Dusty Creek 3 days later. He went quietly, not dramatically, with a wagon of personal effects and 3 of his hired men, headed toward Dallas where his lawyers were. He did not come to say goodbye to anyone. The non-ranch hand employees, including Deke and Fuller, were simply gone one morning. The Voss Ranch operation continued under the management of a foreman who was, by all accounts, a perfectly decent man who had been working cattle his whole life and had no investment in the Voss family's legal troubles. No charges were immediately filed against Harlan Voss personally. Ada understood with the frustration of practical reality that proving personal knowledge of the original fraud against the son rather than the father was a complicated legal matter and might take time. But the land investigation was sufficient. The fraud was formally documented. The land would be restored. It was enough. Not everything, but enough. The petition for property restoration was filed in December. While they waited for the court ruling, which the Attorney General's office indicated would likely take several months, life in Dusty Creek continued with its ordinary and extraordinary business. Ada taught her classes. Elena Vargas gave a reading recital at the Christmas program that made Mrs. Vargas cry and made Ada very quietly wipe her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Caleb Quinn, who had been brittle and defended for so long, stood up at the same program and read a composition he had written about his parents, a straightforward, clear-eyed, deeply feeling piece of writing that was the best thing Ada had read from a 12-year-old in her career. And afterward he was red-faced and furious when the adults around him were visibly moved, which was its own form of proof that he was going to be all right. Wesley came to the Christmas program in a clean shirt with his hair combed, and when he sat beside Ada in the pew, he was close enough that their shoulders were touching, and neither of them moved apart. The town noticed. Dusty Creek was a small town. It had been noticing for a while. After the program, when most of the congregation had gone and the Reverend Mosley was extinguishing the candles, Wesley stood with Ada in the cold night outside the church, their breath making small clouds in the December air, and said, "Ada, I need to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I know the property ruling hasn't come yet. I know there's uncertainty about the ranch's future. I know this is," he stopped. "I know I'm asking before a lot of things are resolved." Ada waited. "Will you marry me?" he said, with a directness that suggested he had been working up to it for some time and had decided the working up was taking longer than the question warranted. Ada looked at him in the cold December dark, at his careful, earnest, weather-worn face, at the man who had fixed a perfectly fine window latch 4 times because he wanted an excuse to see her, who had slept in his barn to keep her safe, who had carried his family's fight for 4 years without bending. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He pulled her into his arms with a relief so complete that she felt it like a physical thing, the long exhale of a man who has been braced for a different answer. "I should have a ring," he said. "I don't have a ring yet. I was going to go to San Antonio after the ruling." "Wesley," Ada said, her face against his neck, "I do not care about a ring. You should have one. I will have one eventually. Right now I have you, and that is considerably more than adequate." He held her tightly in the cold night outside the church, and she was warm, and the stars were enormous overhead, and from inside the church she could hear the Reverend Mosley singing something quietly to himself as he finished with the candles, and the world was, in this moment, very good. They were married in March 1882. The court ruling on the land restoration had come in February, exactly as the Attorney General's office had predicted. The 47 acres of Quinn land were formally returned to the Quinn family, with a state finding of fraudulent transfer on record. It wasn't everything the Quinns had lost over the decades, but it was the largest and most documented piece, and it was returned. Wesley stood in the land office in Dusty Creek when the paperwork was finalized with an expression that Ada would remember the rest of her life, quiet and still and completely present, honoring the moment. The wedding was at the church in Dusty Creek on a bright March morning. Reverend Mosley officiated. Mrs. Crane stood up for Ada, declaring herself deeply honored, and also that she had known since the day Ada arrived that things would go this direction, which Ada suspected was not entirely accurate but was generous. Caleb stood up for Wesley, wearing a new jacket that he was clearly very uncomfortable in, and that he wore without complaining because his brother asked him to, which was a form of love. Ada wore a dress she had ordered from San Antonio, pale blue, practical in the way that meant she could also wear it to other occasions, with pearl buttons at the cuffs. Wesley gave her a ring he had commissioned from a jeweler in San Antonio, simple and gold, which fit her finger as though it had always meant to be there. Elena Vargas was there with her family, and afterward she pressed a wildflower posy into Ada's hands that she had made herself, which Ada kept pressed between the pages of a book for the rest of her life. The reception was at the ranch house, which Ada and Mrs. Crane and several women of the town had transformed over the previous 2 days into something genuinely festive, with dried flowers and clean tablecloths and food brought from every household in a 3-mile radius. It was, by any reasonable measure, the best party Dusty Creek had seen in years. At one point in the afternoon, Wesley found Ada standing in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, looking out at the guests, with an expression he had learned to read as the particular combination of full and overwhelmed that she got when good things happened. He stood beside her. "All right, more than all right," she said. "This is ours," she said, meaning the room, the ranch, the people in it, the whole complicated, beautiful life. "It is," he said. He took her hand, the ring on it new and warm, and stood beside her in the doorway of his grandfather's stone house, watching their community eat and talk and celebrate them. And Ada leaned into him and felt the solid, reliable reality of him beside her, and thought that her father, the ink-stained printer who had raised her to read between lines and to understand that true things needed to be preserved and distributed, would have been very happy today. Spring came fully to the Texas plains, and with it the particular green that appeared briefly every year in that otherwise golden-brown landscape, the mesquite leafing out, the grasses pushing up, wildflowers scattered across the flat country in purples and yellows. Ada planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the ranch house, because the soil there was good and the aspect was right, and because she had always wanted a garden and had never before had the right kind of permanence to plant one. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse. She had been asked by the school board, rather awkwardly given the Voss family's former influence over it, whether she intended to remain in her position, and she had said she did, for as long as they wanted her. The board, several members of whom had privately been ashamed of their own silence during the Voss years, was visibly relieved. Caleb, 13 now, was in the process of becoming a person in a way that was genuinely wonderful to watch. He had Ada's books and Wesley's sense of purpose and his parents' memory, and the particular resilience of a child who has lost much and built back on the foundation of what remained. He still had the brittle edges, probably always would. But they were the edges of someone shaping into something, not the edges of someone breaking apart. In the summer, James Pell died in Dallas as he had expected to. Ada learned this through Thomas Reed, who had maintained a quiet correspondence with her throughout the spring. She told Wesley, and they sat with it quietly for an evening, honoring the man who had made the necessary choice at the end of his life. His testimony had held. His affidavit was in the official record. Whatever the rest of his life had been, that last choice was solid. On a warm July evening, Wesley found Ada in the kitchen garden in the last light, kneeling in the dirt, checking the tomato plants with the focused expression she gave to everything she cared about. "Ada," she looked up. He was standing at the garden's edge with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between nervous and trying not to look nervous. "What?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "that the east bedroom might want a different use." Ada sat back on her heels and looked at him. The east bedroom was the one Caleb didn't use, the extra room at the back of the stone house that currently held old tack and extra lumber. "What kind of different use?" she said, very carefully. He looked at her steadily. "The kind that requires clearing it out and perhaps putting in a smaller bed." Ada's chest expanded with something warm and large. "Wesley Quinn," she said. "I'm not saying anything definitive," he said, with the particular care of a man managing hope. "I'm saying I was thinking." Ada stood up and crossed to him and put both hands on his chest and looked up at him with everything she felt. "Clear out the east bedroom," she said. He smiled. The full one, the real one that she still felt as a gift every time it appeared. They cleared out the east bedroom in August. By September, Ada knew with quiet certainty that it had been a good instinct. She told Wesley on a Sunday morning before church, standing in the kitchen with her coffee, in the plain, straightforward way she did most things. Wesley sat down at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a long moment, and Ada watched him, the stillness that meant he was feeling something large and was organizing it. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so nakedly joyful, so completely unguarded, that it was like seeing another version of him, the version that existed before everything had required such careful protection. "All right," he said, which was insufficient, and he knew it, and she laughed. "All right," she said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and pulled her close with a tenderness that was not careful, not restrained, just whole and complete and certain, and said against her hair, "There are no adequate words, I'm trying." "I know," she said. "I love you." He held her tighter. "I love you." The words came more easily than they once had. 4 months of marriage had done that, more than I know how to say. "You say it fine," she told him. Caleb, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a book and trying not to look like he was listening, looked up with an expression that was 13 years old and male and therefore technically dismissive, but underneath which was plainly visible the particular happiness of a child who has watched the people he loves be happy. "Are you going to tell me or not?" he said. Wesley looked at Ada. Ada looked at Caleb. "You're going to be an uncle," she said. Caleb's expression did 3 things in rapid succession. First, it attempted to be cool about this. Then it failed to be cool about it. Then it gave up entirely, and he looked exactly as happy as he was. "A boy, hopefully," he said, with the confidence of 13. "We'll see," Ada said. Their son was born in the spring of 1883, on a Thursday in May when the mesquite was greening and the windows of the ranch house were open to let in the mild air. He was delivered by the Dusty Creek doctor, who had reduced his drinking considerably over the winter and was, on this occasion, entirely professional. Wesley was present the whole time because Ada had asked him to be, and because there was no consideration under which he would have been anywhere else. They named him Daniel James Quinn, Daniel for Wesley's father, James for James Pell, the dying man who had chosen truth. Caleb held his nephew for the first time with the rigid concentration of someone trying very hard not to drop something important, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused ancient gaze of newborns, and Caleb said, in a voice that was working very hard to be casual, "He's all right." "He's extraordinary," Ada said from the bed. "He's very small," Caleb said. "He'll get bigger," Wesley said from where he was sitting beside Ada with his hand in hers. "Good," Caleb said. "I need him to be useful." Ada laughed, tired and triumphant, and full of the particular radiance of a woman who has just done something enormous and knows it. Wesley looked at her with a steady, complete love that was not new but was deeper than it had been, layered now with everything they had built, the evidence preserved in Latin grammars, the roof repaired on Saturdays, the hand held across a student's desk, the land returned to its rightful owners, the garden in the good South soil, and this small new person with his grandfather's name and his future entirely his own. Thomas Reed came to Dusty Creek in the fall of 1883, making a personal journey that he said was partly professional and partly a desire to see how things had turned out. He was a quiet man in his 40s, with the specific calm of someone who has spent a career working in records and has developed a philosophical relationship with the truth. Ada and Wesley had him to supper at the ranch house, and Daniel slept in his cradle by the stove while the adults talked, and Reed told them that the formal proceedings against the remaining Voss land fraud had concluded in Austin, with findings against the estate, and that the precedent had been used to open 2 other similar investigations in neighboring counties. "You were a stone thrown in a pond," Reed told Wesley. "The rings are still going outward." Wesley accepted this in his characteristic way, quietly, with a nod that contained more than it showed. Ada, who knew the full map of what was under that quiet, reached over and took his hand at the table. Reed noticed, and smiled the way people smile when they see something that makes the world seem worth the trouble. After Reed left and Caleb had gone to bed and Daniel was sleeping his small, confident sleep, Ada and Wesley sat on the porch of the ranch house in the October air, the stars doing their Texas best overhead, and it was very quiet in the particular way that the plains are quiet at night, a silence that is not empty but full. "Happy," Wesley said. It was a word he had come to more lately, not because he used easy words but because he had found gradually that easy words could carry real weight if you meant them. Ada leaned against his shoulder. "Impossibly, unreasonably happy," she said. "Yes." He put his arm around her. The land lay out around them in all directions, the restored Quinn acres on the west side visible only as darkness but present, real, returned to the story it belonged in. Inside the house, their son slept. Somewhere in the town, Elena Vargas was probably reading by candlelight, which she did until her mother made her put the light out. The school roof was solid. The Latin grammar still held its shape on the third shelf, the secret it had kept long since made unnecessary by outcomes better than hiding. Pete Holloway had moved in with his daughter's family in Waco earlier that year, reporting that the garden was difficult in the city but that he was otherwise comfortable. He had sent Wesley a brief note when the land ruling came through, just 3 words, "Your father knew," which Wesley had read once and folded carefully and kept. Caleb Quinn would eventually go to university in Austin, because Ada would make that possible, and because he would earn it completely on his own terms, studying law with the particular focus of someone who knows exactly why law matters. He would carry his parents' names and his brother's stubbornness and his teacher's belief in him, and he would make all of it into something that outlasted all of them. But that was future, waiting in its proper place. Right now was the porch and the October night, and Wesley Quinn's arm around Ada Atwood Quinn, and the sound of their son breathing inside the house. "The east bedroom might want a different use again," Wesley said, very casually watching the stars. Ada turned and looked at him. In the moonlight his face was still and careful, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was not as casual as he was trying to appear. "You want another one," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "You and your thinking," Ada said, and laughed and kissed him on the cheek and leaned back against his shoulder in the warm October dark. The land was good. The truth was on record. The school roof held. The garden grew. Their boy slept in his cradle with his grandfather's name and his whole life ahead of him. And Wesley Quinn and Ada Atwood Quinn sat together on the porch of the stone house that 3 generations of Quinns had called home, in the vast and permanent dark of the Texas night. 2 people who had found each other in the middle of a fight worth fighting, and had never looked back, loved and known and held, completely and permanently and well.